Megan pulled into her driveway just as the last streaks of orange and pink disappeared from the horizon. The early evening air was crisp, hinting at the coming fall. She turned off the car and leaned back in her seat, letting out a long breath. It had been another grueling day at the office, filled with endless spreadsheets, passive-aggressive emails, and the suffocating buzz of fluorescent lights. The soft glow from the porch light illuminated the front of her small house. It wasn't much, just a modest two-bedroom bungalow, but it was hers. The thought gave her a fleeting sense of pride as she grabbed her bag from the passenger seat and stepped out of the car. From inside, a deep bark greets her. "Tyler," she murmured, smiling despite her fatigue. Her dog's voice had a way of cutting through the day's stresses like nothing else. As she opened the door, Tyler bounded toward her, his sleek black coat shining even in the dim light of the living room. His ears perked up, and his stubby tail wagged furiously as he pressed his muscular frame against her legs. "Hey, buddy," Megan said, crouching down to ruffle his fur. Tyler licked her cheek, his warm breath making her laugh softly. "Missed me, huh?" She set her bag on the floor and kicked off her shoes. The house smelled faintly of lavender, thanks to the diffuser she'd left running in the morning. It was a small comfort, a reminder that this space was her sanctuary. Megan headed to the kitchen to grab a snack, with Tyler trotting close behind. She opened the fridge, scanned the shelves, and settled on a leftover salad. As she ate, Tyler sat beside her, his piercing brown eyes fixed on her every move. "You always look at me like that," she said, shaking her head. "Like I'm the most interesting person in the world." Tyler tilted his head, as if he understood. Megan chuckled and reached down to scratch behind his ears. He leaned into her touch, his tail thumping against the floor. After dinner, Megan changed into sweatpants and a hoodie, then settled on the couch with her laptop. Tyler jumped up beside her, resting his head on her thigh. His presence was soothing, a warm weight that grounded her. She scrolled aimlessly through social media, stopping occasionally to watch funny videos or like a friend's post. The monotony of her routine was both comforting and suffocating. At 26, she felt stuck, caught between the freedom of her college years and the responsibilities of adulthood. Tyler shifted, pressing closer to her. Megan glanced down and smiled. "At least I've got you," she said. The words hung in the air longer than she expected. There was something about the way Tyler looked at her, so loyal, so attentive, that made her chest tighten. She brushed the thought away, attributing it to exhaustion. The evening stretched on, and Megan found herself sinking deeper into the couch, Tyler still by her side. She ran her fingers absently through his fur, marveling at how soft it felt. "You're a good boy," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the television. Tyler's ears twitched, and he let out a low, contented sigh. Megan smiled again, but this time, a strange unease crept into her thoughts. It wasn't anything she could pinpoint, just a fleeting sense of discomfort that she quickly dismissed. As the clock approached midnight, Megan finally decided to call it a night. She stood, stretching her arms above her head, and Tyler jumped down from the couch to follow her. "Time for bed," she said, turning off the lights and heading to her bedroom. Tyler padded after her, his nails clicking softly against the hardwood floor. Megan climbed into bed and pulled the covers up to her chin. But as she lay there, staring at the ceiling, her mind began to wander. Images of Tyler, his intelligent eyes, his strong, sleek body, flashed unbidden through her thoughts. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to focus on something else, anything else. "It's just stress," she whispered to herself. "You're overthinking." Tyler let out a soft whine, as if sensing her turmoil. Megan turned to look at him, her heart aching with a tenderness she couldn't explain. "Good night, Tyler," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. As sleep finally claimed her, Megan's last conscious thought was of Tyler, faithful, unwavering Tyler, and the strange new feelings stirring within her. The morning light streamed through the blinds, waking Megan earlier than she had planned. She stretched lazily, her mind still clouded with remnants of her dreams. They had been vivid, Tyler had been in them, though she couldn't quite recall the details. She rolled over and groaned, burying her face in the pillow. "Get a grip," she muttered to herself. Tyler's nails clicked against the floor as he approached the bed. By the time they returned home, Megan felt more awake, though a nagging sense of unease lingered. She chalked it up to the odd dreams she'd had and pushed the feeling aside. After showering and changing into comfortable clothes, she settled onto the couch with her laptop. Tyler lay beside her, his head resting on her thigh. It was a familiar scene, one they'd shared countless times before, but today, something felt different. Megan's fingers hovered over the keyboard as her thoughts wandered. She glanced down at Tyler, who was watching her with those same attentive eyes. His gaze felt almost human, as though he could see straight through her. "What are you thinking about, huh?" she asked, her voice light but tinged with nervous laughter. Tyler's ears perked up at the sound of her voice, and he nudged her hand with his nose. Megan smiled, her unease momentarily forgotten. She scratched behind his ears, and he leaned into her touch, his tail wagging lazily. The warmth of his body pressed against her leg was comforting, but it also stirred something unfamiliar. Megan's hand stilled, her breath hitching as a wave of guilt washed over her. "What is wrong with me?" she whispered, pulling her hand away. Tyler whined softly, sensing her sudden change in mood. Megan shook her head and stood.
The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Megan cooked dinner, watched a few episodes of a crime drama, and tried to ignore the nagging thoughts that refused to leave her alone. As the clock ticked closer to midnight, she finally decided to head to bed. Tyler followed her, as he always did, and curled up in his dog bed. Megan lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling. Her mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions, guilt, confusion, and a strange, undeniable pull that both terrified and intrigued her. She turned onto her side, her eyes drifting to Tyler. He was already asleep, his breathing slow and steady. Megan's chest tightened, and she squeezed her eyes shut, willing the feelings away. But as the night stretched on, her resolve began to waver. She found herself sitting up, her heart pounding in her chest. Tyler stirred, lifting his head to look at her. "Come here," she whispered, her voice trembling. Tyler hesitated for a moment before climbing onto the bed. Megan's hands trembled as she reached out to stroke his fur, her touch hesitant at first, but growing bolder with each passing moment. Her mind screamed at her to stop, to push him away and pretend this had never happened. But her body betrayed her, drawn to him in a way she couldn't explain. The line between right and wrong blurred as Megan gave in to the moment, crossing a boundary she never thought she would. When it was over, she lay in the dark, her body trembling and her mind racing. Tyler curled up beside her, his presence both comforting and overwhelming. Megan stared at the ceiling, tears slipping down her cheeks as the weight of what she had done settled over her. She knew there was no going back, no undoing the choices she had made. As sleep finally claimed her, Megan's last thought was a desperate plea for understanding, for a way to reconcile the person she had been
Megan
with, the
woke to
person
the
she was
soft glow
becoming.
of morning sunlight streaming through her curtains. For a moment, everything felt normal. Tyler was curled up at the foot of the bed, his breathing steady and peaceful. But as the events of the previous night rushed back to her, a crushing wave of guilt washed over her. She sat up, pressing her palms against her eyes as if she could block out the memories. "What have I done?" she whispered. Tyler stirred, lifting his head to look at her with the same innocent gaze he always had. Megan's stomach churned. To him, nothing had changed, but for her, everything had. Throwing off the covers, she got out of bed and headed to the bathroom. She turned on the faucet and splashed cold water on her face, trying to ground herself. Staring into the mirror, she barely recognized the person looking back at her. "You can't fall apart," she told herself firmly. "Not now." After a long shower, she dressed in a loose t-shirt and jeans, hoping the casual outfit would help her feel normal. Tyler followed her to the kitchen, his tail wagging expectantly. Megan forced a smile as she filled his bowl with kibble, but her hands shook. "Here you go," she said, her voice strained. Tyler ate happily, oblivious to her turmoil. Megan made herself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the steam curling up from the mug. Her thoughts were a tangled mess of shame, confusion, and a strange, lingering desire she couldn't fully suppress. The day passed in a haze. Megan cleaned the house with an intensity that bordered on obsessive, hoping the physical activity would distract her. She scrubbed the kitchen counters, vacuumed the carpets, and even reorganized the pantry. But no matter how hard she worked, she couldn't escape her thoughts. By mid-afternoon, she was emotionally and physically drained. She sank onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. A knock at the door startled her. Heart pounding, she got up and peered through the peephole. It was her neighbor Lisa, holding a casserole dish. Megan hesitated before opening the door. "Hey, Lisa," she said, forcing a cheerful tone. "Hi, Megan. I made too much lasagna and thought I'd share," Lisa said with a warm smile. "Thanks, that's really sweet of you." Megan took the dish, grateful for the distraction. Lisa's eyes drifted to Tyler, who had padded over to sit by Megan's side. "How's my favorite pup doing?" she asked, crouching down to scratch behind his ears. "He's great," Megan replied, though her voice wavered. Lisa looked up, her brow furrowing. "You okay? You seem a little off." Megan plastered on a smile. "Just tired, that's all. But thanks for checking." Lisa nodded, her concern evident but unspoken. "Well, if you need anything, just let me know." As soon as Lisa left, Megan set the casserole on the counter and leaned against it, her legs feeling like jelly. She couldn't let anyone suspect that something was wrong. That evening, she took Tyler for a long walk, hoping the fresh air would clear her head. The streets were quiet, the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional bark of a distant dog. Megan found herself talking to Tyler as they walked, her words tumbling out in a rush. "I don't know what's happening to me. I feel like I'm losing my mind. I know it's wrong, but I can't stop thinking about it." Tyler glanced up at her, his tail wagging slightly as if to reassure her. Megan felt a pang of guilt so sharp it nearly took her breath away. When they returned home, Megan tried to distract herself with a movie, but her attention kept drifting. She glanced at Tyler, who was lying on the floor near the couch, his head resting on his paws. She sighed and turned off the TV, unable to focus. That night, Megan lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling. She couldn't shake the memory of the previous night or the conflicted feelings it had stirred in her. Part of her wanted to pretend it had never happened, to bury it deep and move on. But another part of her, a darker, more dangerous part, wondered if it could happen again. Tyler jumped onto the bed, curling up beside her. Megan hesitated before reaching out to stroke his fur. Her hand trembled as it moved over his back, her thoughts spiraling out of control. "No," she whispered, pulling her hand away. "This has to stop." But as she lay there, her resolve began to crumble. The weight of her guilt was almost unbearable, but so was the pull she felt toward him. When sleep finally claimed her, it was restless Hannah
and
picked
filled.
up after a few rings, her voice bright and cheerful. "Hey, Meg. What's up?" "Hi," Megan said, her voice trembling. I need to talk." Hannah's tone immediately softened. "Of course. What's wrong?" Megan hesitated, struggling to find the right words. "I've been feeling off lately. Like I'm losing control." "Are you okay? Is it work? Or something else?" Megan swallowed hard, her throat tight. "I don't know. It's like I'm trapped in my own head, and I can't get out." Hannah's concern was palpable. "Meg, you've been under a lot of stress. Maybe you just need a break, a trip, or something to clear your mind." Megan nodded, even though her sister couldn't see her. "Yeah, maybe." After a few more minutes of vague reassurances, Megan ended the call. She felt a small sense of relief, but it was fleeting. Hannah's well-meaning advice couldn't touch the core of her turmoil. She spent the rest of the day avoiding Tyler as much as possible. She busied herself with chores, took a walk around the block alone, and even tried meditating, though her mind refused to quiet. By evening, she felt no closer to clarity. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the house in soft shadows, Megan sat on the couch with a glass of wine. Tyler lay nearby, his eyes closed in contentment. The silence was heavy, filled only with the occasional creak of the house settling. Megan took a deep breath and spoke aloud, as if to the empty room. "You need to stop this. You need to let it go." Tyler stirred, lifting his head to look at her. Megan's chest tightened. She set the wineglass down and buried her face in her hands. "You don't even know what you've done to me," she whispered. That night, as she lay in bed, Megan made a decision. She couldn't keep living like this. Tomorrow, she would make a change, something drastic, something to break free from the cycle she'd trapped herself in. The next morning, Megan woke with a sense of determination. She started her day as usual, but avoided lingering near Tyler. After breakfast, she sat down at her laptop and began searching for therapists in the area. Scrolling through the listings, her heart raced. Admitting she needed help felt like a monumental step, but she couldn't deny it any longer. She found a practice nearby and dialed the number before she could talk herself out of it. "Good morning, Pinewood Counseling," a receptionist answered. "Hi," Megan said, her voice shaky. "I'd like to make an appointment." The receptionist asked a few questions, and within minutes, Megan had a date and time set. She hung up the phone and leaned back in her chair, feeling a strange mix of relief and anxiety. For the first time in weeks, she felt like she was taking a step toward reclaiming her life. But the road ahead was daunting, and she knew it would take every ounce of strength she had to face it. That evening, she took Tyler for a walk, trying to focus on the simple act of moving forward. The crisp air filled her lungs, and for the first time in days, she felt a glimmer of hope. As they walked, Megan found herself speaking to Tyler again, but this time her words were different. "I don't know how we got here," she said quietly, "but I'm going to fix this. I promise." Tyler looked up at her, his tail wagging slightly, and for the first time, Megan felt a sense of peace. When they returned home, Megan sat down at the kitchen table and opened her journal. She hadn't written in it for years, but now it felt like the right time. She poured her thoughts onto the page, unfiltered and raw. The act of writing was cathartic, and by the time she closed the journal, she felt lighter. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she was ready to face it, one step at a time. The morning dawned brighter than Megan expected, sunlight filtering through the blinds and warming her face. For the first time in weeks, she felt the stirrings of genuine optimism. It was a fragile thing, like the first green shoot pushing through frost, but it was there. She rose from bed, determined to make the most of the day. After feeding Tyler and brewing a cup of coffee, Megan returned to her journal. The words from the previous night stared back at her, a tangled mix of guilt, longing, and determination. She flipped to a fresh page and wrote at the top, "Steps forward." The list came slowly, each point representing a piece of her fractured self she hoped to reclaim. 1. Attend therapy. 2. Rebuild confidence. 3. Strengthen relationships. 4. Forgive yourself. The last item lingered on the page, heavy with meaning. Megan stared at it, wondering if she could ever truly achieve it. With a deep breath, she closed the journal and turned her focus to Tyler. He lay sprawled on the floor, his ears twitching as he dozed. Megan knelt beside him, running her fingers through his fur. "I'm sorry," she murmured. His tail thumped in response, and Megan felt a small pang of relief. Dogs, she thought, had a way of offering unconditional forgiveness. Later that day, Megan arrived at the counseling office. The building was modest but inviting, with soft blue walls and comfortable chairs in the waiting area. A woman with kind eyes introduced herself as Dr. Bennett and led Megan into a quiet room filled with books and warm lighting. As Megan sat on the couch, her heart pounded. She fidgeted with the hem of her sweater, unsure where to begin. "Take your time," Dr. Bennett said gently. Megan hesitated before speaking. "I don't even know why I'm here. I feel like I've lost myself." Dr. Bennett nodded. "That's a good place to start. Tell me more." Over the next hour, Megan shared pieces of her life, carefully avoiding the darkest corners of her mind. She spoke of the stress of work, the loneliness of living in a small town, and her complicated feelings about Tyler. Dr. Bennett listened without judgment, her presence calm and steady. By the end of the session, Megan felt a small but significant shift. She wasn't alone in this. In the weeks that followed, Megan's life began to change. Therapy became a regular part of her routine, and she found herself opening up more with each session. Dr. Bennett encouraged her to explore the root of her emotions, gently guiding her through the tangled mess of her thoughts. Outside of therapy, Megan took small steps to reconnect with the world. She joined a local book club, something she'd always wanted to do but never had the courage to try. She reconnected with old friends, even reaching out to her sister Hannah for a long overdue lunch. Through it all, Tyler remained a constant presence. Their walks became longer, and their bond stronger. Megan began to see him not as a reminder of her shame, but as a source of unconditional love and support. One crisp autumn afternoon, Megan and Tyler were walking along the trail near her house. The leaves had turned brilliant shades of red and gold, crunching underfoot as they moved. Megan paused, taking in the beauty around her. The air was cool and refreshing, carrying with it a sense of renewal. "Come on, Tyler," she said, her voice lighter than it had been in months. "Let's keep going." As they continued down the path, Megan felt a sense of clarity she hadn't experienced in a long time. She wasn't entirely healed, not yet, but she was moving forward. And for the first time, that felt like enough months passed, and Megan's life began to take on a new rhythm. The seasons shifted from the crisp chill of autumn to the quiet stillness of winter. Snow blanketed the small town, covering rooftops and sidewalks in soft white, as if nature itself were offering a fresh slate. Megan's morning started early now. She had taken a part-time job at the local animal shelter, a place she initially visited out of curiosity but quickly grew to love. Working with the dogs, cats, and occasional rabbits filled her days with purpose. "Morning, Megan," said Claire, the shelter manager, one snowy morning as Megan walked in. "Morning. How's Max doing?" Megan asked, referring to an anxious lab mix they'd been working with. "Better, thanks to you. He actually let someone pet him yesterday." Megan smiled. Hearing progress like this warmed her heart. In helping the animals heal, she felt her own wounds slowly healing. At home, Megan's bond with Tyler was stronger than ever. She had taken up a new routine of training him, teaching him tricks, and rewarding him with treats. It wasn't just about discipline, it was about rebuilding trust and strengthening their connection. One evening, as Tyler performed a perfect sit and stay, Megan knelt beside him and kissed the top of his head. "Good boy," she whispered. He wagged his tail enthusiastically, his eyes full of devotion. In therapy, Megan continued to confront the complexities of her emotions. One session, Dr. Bennett asked her a question that lingered in her mind for days. "What does forgiveness mean to you?" At first, Megan didn't know how to answer. Forgiveness felt like such an abstract concept, something people talked about but rarely achieved. "It's letting go, I guess," she said finally. Dr. Bennett nodded. "Letting go of what?" Megan paused. "Of the guilt. Of the shame. Of the need to punish myself for something I can't change." It was a breakthrough moment. For so long, Megan had carried the weight of her mistakes like a punishment she believed she deserved. But now she saw a glimmer of hope, a way to release herself from that burden. As winter turned to spring, Megan took her first solo trip in years. She drove to the mountains, a place she had visited with her family as a child. The air was cool and crisp, and the sight of the towering peaks filled her with awe. Standing at the edge of a serene lake, Megan felt a wave of peace wash over her. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, the scent of pine and earth grounding her in the present moment. "This is what healing feels like," she thought. Back in town, Megan began to open herself up to new possibilities. She joined a local hiking group, made a few new friends, and even went on a couple of casual dates. Though she wasn't ready for a serious relationship, the idea of connection no longer felt so daunting. One evening, as she sat on her porch with Tyler at her feet, Megan reflected on how far she had come. The shadows of her past no longer loomed as heavily over her. Instead, they felt like a distant echo, a reminder of where she had been and how much she had grown. The final step in Megan's journey came unexpectedly. One day, while sorting through a box of old letters and photographs, she stumbled upon a picture of herself as a teenager. In the photo, she was grinning ear to ear, her arms wrapped around a scruffy mutt named Buddy, the dog she had grown up with. Megan traced the edges of the photo with her fingers, a lump forming in her throat. "You would have liked Tyler," she said aloud, her voice soft. For the first time, Megan allowed herself to feel the full weight of her emotions, grief, joy, regret, and hope, all mingling together. And as she set the photo down, she realized something profound: forgiveness wasn't a single act. It was a process, a journey. And she was finally on her way. That evening, as Megan and Tyler curled up on the couch, she felt a quiet contentment settle over her. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, she felt ready to face it. "I think we're going to be okay," she whispered, scratching Tyler's ears. He wagged his tail in agreement, and Megan smiled. Because in that moment, she believed it too.